feeling quite inspired this afternoon. I really loved listening to Jill this morning. She was amazing. And then just got to see Jimmy Fan, who was at the conference about 20 years ago when he was just setting up Koto. So if you're in Vietnam, you have to look up Koto and go and have a meal at one of his venues. But the program so far has been great, and I think we will round it out today with another superstar. So I have the very special pleasure of introducing my friend, Kerry Ramirez, for the final session. Now, we have the formal bio for Kerry, and I'll let you peruse that at your leisure, but you also heard quite a long-form bio, I think, at the award last night, so I won't go through that again. But many of us know Kerry from YouTube, from his very, very helpful video series that he puts out. And he was just saying before, or Dimity was saying before, we should have had the numbers up on the screen as he does the countdown to his video series, just as a bit of a signature for Study Move. But I wanted to start with the 3 things that you may not know about Kerry. And I've promised not to mention tequila, but we will talk about that after. You know, it's 5:20 that we're finishing. I've worked with Kerry for more than 20 years. We started when we were both working at Macquarie, and Kerry was an international student, and came in as our data geek. And he's still a data geek, but a much, much more famous one now. Kerry was the best ever Macquarie alumni ambassador for the Master of International Business, and I had the pleasure of working with Kerry in that capacity when I would go to Mexico, and we would put up the banner and hand out brochures, and Kerry would take all of the business inquiries and I would take everything else, and we had a great system worked out there. But fortunately, Kerry then came back to Australia and has been a great asset for our sector ever since. Kerry and Dimity also have 2 beautiful and talented children and a dog called Cleo. So I'll let him show you photos of his dog later. But there is so much commentary in our sector today, and something that Kerry and I agree on is the value of data to inform both commentary and the decisions that we are making for our work on a daily basis. So that's where we come together, and this is the whole culture of the data group with IEAA, and I think some of that will continue today. I was recently working on a piece for NAFSA on a new take on brain drain. And so this was, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about it, and I talked to Kerry and John and Melissa and some people who are really thinking about the global picture of the data. And Kerry and I sent my piece to him for some feedback, and he came back and said, I think it might just be a market correction. And that's in relation to Australia, but also a little bit around policy around the world. And so I spent about the next 6 weeks thinking about Kerry's comment on whether it's actually a correction, which in economic terms is a 10 to 20% decline, followed by a recovery. I ended up in the article putting both options. So I did a nod to Kerry's market correction, but said it could actually be we're changing course on the international trajectory. And so I wanted to frame this session with a little bit of an overlay about what we can learn from the past, how that impacts what we're thinking now, and what that means when we're looking at the future. And in an area where we're facing a lot of challenges in policy, but we also know that visas have decreased in the last year, it's a good time to reflect and look at the data and really take those lessons from our history and learn what we can apply to our jobs today. So I'm going to hand over to Kerry, and I'm going to sit back down so we can all enjoy his presentation, and I'll come back afterwards. So please be thinking of your questions, pop them into the app, and we'll have a bit of a chat when Kerry's finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zavina. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for joining this AIEC session, the last one of the day, in a day that it has been full of very interesting conversations across many different topics. As Davina said, my name is Kerry Ramirez. I'm not going to show photos of my dog at the moment, maybe later. Today I'm very excited just to look at what is the data perspective on the impact that we had in the changes on the policy framework. As we know, it has been 2 years exactly since the government basically signed or basically explained that the changes were coming. It has been 2 years of uncertainty, 2 years of volatility, and I truly believe that the data has been a very effective tool really to get some perspectives and to get a better understanding on how these different policies are affecting the way in which we operate. But I also think that we need to acknowledge that in this particular period, everybody has been affected in very different ways. So to tackle this specific presentation, it's important just to acknowledge that everybody has a different perspective on the impact on the policies. And for that reason, we're going to try just to take a few steps back, zoom out, and trying to learn in general what are the main factors or the main changes that we have seen in the sector. Okay? So what we're going to cover today is 2 main topics. Really, as I said, let's just look back, take some steps, and see what are the main changes that we have seen since implementation of the changes in the policy framework. And from there, we're going to take a little bit of a leap of faith and trying just to figure out, and hopefully we can do all this together, what the next steps, what can we expect in the future. As Davina said, we'll have time for Q&A, so feel free just to put your questions in the conference app. But I always think that in these sessions there is great knowledge around everybody that is sitting in this room. So please feel free not only to put your questions, but also your comments, because it's such a rich and an important topic that we will be great to hear from you what you think about all this. All right, so here we go. And before I really start jumping into the numbers, I really just want to acknowledge a very personal story. Every time that I have been here at AIEC, it has been quite an interesting experience. But my very first AIEC was in Gadigal, Sydney in 2004. So looking at my personal collection of data, I have been here for nearly more than 20 years. And I remember still vividly my first AIEC. The vibe of that AIEC was very special. It was a vibe of an industry that it was positive, forward-thinking, and looking for ways, procedures, structures, to do what we love to do in this sector, which is just to provide extraordinary learning experiences to individuals from all around the world. And I was very lucky to witness that vibe continued year after year. And also with that vibe, we actually saw the growth of international students coming to Australia. And this is my first chart that basically shows those initial years of the growth of the industry, because we used to call it an industry. And as you can see, for about 190,000 international students that we had in Australia, we actually experienced a very, very rapid growth in just about 5 years. In just 5 years, we nearly doubled the number of students. It was a very, very interesting part of the history of the sector, or the industry, I always call it. And it was, as I said, a very special vibe just to see that we were able to do more of what we love to do. Now, that's when we actually had the first downturn on the number of international students. So after that explosive growth, we actually had a period where international student numbers went down. It's a period that a lot of you will remember. It was called the perfect storm. And it was a combination of different factors. We actually had a review in certain policies that affect part of the sector. This is kind of familiar. But we also had other things that affect us. A big one was that the Australian dollar was very high. So that made Australia, in comparison with other currencies, a very expensive destination. And that created that downturn in the number of students. But what I think was interesting is that the vibe at AIEC every year continued. We still were forward-thinking. We still were very positive. But that's when the sector introduced what I think were very two important concepts. One that is how to be sustainable. How can we grow with a sustainable view? And another one that it was very important, it was what it was called a balance. It was actually a concept that it was based on economics. It was trade balance, what we're talking about. But in terms of what we do, what we're trying to do in terms of balance is that in the same way that we were bringing great experiences to students coming into Australia, it was very important to share that view with the students in Australia that could go overseas and actually have extraordinary experience as well and enrich their experience in what we call outbound mobility. That now we call learning abroad, but back in those days it was outbound mobility. So it was a very interesting period, as I said. The sector actually changed the focus a little bit, but we kept having that forward thinking. And once again, we saw a period of growth. We saw several years that the number of internationals kept growing, but it was with a different phase because in this particular period, apart from seeing a large number of students coming in, we also saw a large number of students going out. We actually managed to get that terms of balance in the right place. And we share the benefits of international education with our students that are from our campuses. So in this second period of growth, as you can see, was not as explosive as the first one, but we actually had that experience of growth. But as I said, we actually had one of the best chapters of international education because we also saw more than 60,000 Australian university students going overseas. We had a very well-balanced sector. In fact, we actually had, from a graduate number of students cohort, one of the largest number of students taking international experience from around the world. We were actually have higher levels of participation in compared to other places like the US, the UK, or New Zealand, or even Canada. So 1 in 4 undergraduate Australian students were actually participating abroad. So it was a very interesting period where we actually were able just to combine both things. Now after that, for me, it was 2019, the first time that I felt it was a change in the vibe at AIEC. I think that it was the first time when we actually received a very strong criticism on the level and the volume of international students coming to Australia. And, you know, those criticisms have been all along for many years, but that year actually felt different. The main focus of that criticism it was about the number of students going to metropolitan, basically locations, big cities, and not going to the regions. And what it was quite interesting is that when we were going to start that conversation, we actually had to deal with a bigger challenge. Because as you remember, just a few months after that AIEC, we actually had to deal with one of the biggest challenges that we had to endure within the sector. We closed the borders because that's what has to be done, and we actually saw the biggest downturn ever in the number of international students. But the sector was united, and together we actually managed that big challenge. And once again, we show resilience, and we show what we like to do, and we took care of the welfare of so many students that were here in Australia. And united, actually, and some people will say that it was positive market conditions. Some others, they said that the policies were actually more welcoming back then. But that actually created a very filtered scenario that without really the actions, the commitment from this sector, would not actually take us anywhere. I really think that it was the actions of the sector during that period of COVID and that continuous engagements that we kept with market that allow us just to have that very quick, and I should say unexpected recovery. So in 2023, it took only 18 months just to recover, something that nobody really expected. In fact, most of the analysts, they said it will take 3 years or 5 years. We did it in 18 months. So probably you remember the vibe in that 2023 AIEC. It was joy. We felt that we actually accomplished and actually endured one of the biggest challenges that we ever had. But the party didn't last for a long time. For a Mexican, that's a big problem, actually. But as we know, also at that AIEC, that's when we received the news that the policy framework was changing. And actually, after that quick recovery, that's when we actually saw that the numbers, pretty much they went flat. And they have been flat because the main aspect on the policy settings, it was basically to stop the growth on new student visas, which basically led to this basically flattened on the number of student visa holders in Australia. Now, the question that I have is, why this one feels different? If we have been through something like that, what are the reasons why we actually feel different about this one? And I think there are quite a few factors that can explain this. First of all, well, the most obvious one, this one came from home. The previous one was a combination of external, internal factors. COVID was completely an external shock, but this one came internally. The magnitude actually is quite different across each one of them, but what I think it makes it different is also the fact that in the previous years or the previous periods when we actually had a crisis, we actually had years of growth and then the crisis. And this one actually was during the recovery. So we were really not ready, or we didn't have the resources to cushion any of the effects on the changes that we actually experienced. Now, the other one that I think is quite interesting in terms of recovery is that when we talk about recovery, the sector as international recover, but many other aspects of the education system were still quite shaky. And let me just show you, for example, the trend across the university sector. This chart actually tells so many things of what's happening or what happened previous to what we actually experienced in COVID. What you see on the screen now is the actual aggregate across all the universities every year in the amount of revenue that they report and also the number of expenses that they report. And what you can see is a trend that is quite soft. It actually was going up, but it was not very volatile. So for many, many years, universities were able just to manage some shocks, but it was not a lot of changes. But with COVID, things actually changed. And if you can see here how volatile was the actual aggregate revenue, this includes international, domestic, the whole lot. So basically a massive, massive level of volatility. Something that, as you can see in the chart, universities had never experienced before. In the expenditure side of things, we also had to make big adjustments that brought a lot of volatility. So as you can see, when the changes in the policy framework came, this actually chart takes you to 2023, we were not ready. We were still very shaky. And I think that's one of the reasons why this one feels actually different. Now, the other thing that is important just to acknowledge is that in the past, the percentage of revenue that it was international in comparison to the total revenue, it was about 16.7%. And actually that was like that 15, 14 for many years. Recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, it's actually a lot more. Oh, actually it went a little bit more. So as you can see, it was about 23%. So that change in that particular variable actually shake things even more. Now, the other thing that I think is different about this one is the fact that the changes in the policy framework have been affecting sectors in very different ways. When we had the perfect storm, it was mainly the vet sector, the one that it was affected. Everybody was affected, but it was in particular the vet sector. With COVID, we were all at the same time dealing with the same problem, but this one actually has fractured significantly every sector. And let me show you a chart that shows this. So what I'm going to show you is from the peak number of visas granted that we had in Australia in the last few years. That actually happened in July 2023. I'm going to show you how much it has been the change sector by sector. So if you think about, 40,000 visas granted in July 2023, that was the peak. From there has been obviously an adjustment month by month. So look at the ELICA sector. It has been basically cut in half. Very different to what it has been the experience at the school sector, that it was only 8%. Very different to what we saw in the vet sector, and very different to what we have seen in the higher education sector. So as you can imagine, when you have that level of fracture, it's very, very hard to find some common ground on how to move forward. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we have at the moment. Now, this chart in particular shows also half of the story, because even within sectors, there are actually education providers that have very different paths during this period of dealing with the new policy framework. So let me just show you, for example, the higher education sector, specifically the university sector. So what I'm going to show you is the publicly available data. Oh, actually it was not here, but anyway, it was a chart that basically shows that the commencements across the university sector, they have been actually cut in half. So between 2023 and 2024, the growth of commencements across universities, 20 universities actually had growth, and very substantial growth, and 20 universities actually had a decrease. Actually, I know that the chart is coming up, so I actually went and went ahead too quickly, because this one talks about the ELICO sector. The ELICO sector in particular, and this is because the set of policies that we have been managing and actually dealing with, it has been a group of different policies. And when you have a group of different policies, it's hard really just to understand what are the effects. It has been a group of policies that obviously have been affecting more than other ones. Now this one is the one that refers to the ELICO sector. And as you can see, you don't even need to chat GTP this stuff. When you triple the cost, and I should say the non-refundable cost to apply for a student visa, obviously those programs that they actually have a lower tuition fee will be affected more, because the students, they're actually making that reasonable decision of saying, why should I pay more just to apply for a visa if actually that covers pretty much the cost of the program? And this is what I was trying to show you here. That's the increase on the actual cost of the visa. It tripled since July 2023, but this is the one that is quite interesting. We at StudyMove, we collect a lot of information about a price, and these clearly show why certain sectors have been affected more. So the average cost of an ELICOS program in Australia, with a duration of about 13 weeks, which seems to be the average duration, is about $6,000. So if you're an international student and you on top of that need to pay $2,000 just to apply for a visa, it just simply doesn't make sense. The same for some VET programs. You also will see the annual cost of a VET program, and also our semester abroad programs. So that particular part of the policy is the one that is affecting significantly these sectors, and probably that's the one that it has to be reviewed if we don't want to fracture the sector as a whole a lot more. Now, as I said, going back to higher education, I think I got too excited about it, but this is a very interesting chart. Within education providers across a specific sector, it has been this split. And this is the one that I was trying to show you. So the actual growth in commencements across universities, and you want to see here the chart, every bar represents the growth that each university had in commencements in 2024. You will see that clearly, and I just couldn't believe that it was 20 universities with a decrease and 20 universities with an increase. So basically cutting in half the university sector. So this shows that we are dealing with higher levels of fracture, which, as I said, is making really hard to find common ground. Can you imagine a group of universities sitting together trying to find a strategy together when one university had 60% growth in 1 year and the other one had a decrease of 50%? It's very, very hard to find that common ground, and that's one of the challenges that we're actually going to have to deal with. All right, so that's like the big picture in terms of how sectors have been tracking. But as we know, also the policy framework has been changing the engagement with specific markets, because markets have been reacting also in very different ways. And I just want to share with you some of those recent trends. Starting with our top 3 source markets, which are China, India, and Nepal. And this is the actual latest available number of commencements, which is the July numbers, so year-to-date July. It's very interesting to see that each one of these 3 are actually having a very, very different trend. So for example, China, which actually in 2024 had an increase in commencements, in 2025, because we also have changes in the 2025 policy framework, but obviously that market is reacting differently. Now, in the terms of China, it's also interesting just to see that the main decrease in commencements is just very specifically in postgraduate students. So that's one of the other things that, if I can recommend it, like the data geek tip of the year, is we need to look into more detail and drill down so we really understand how markets are reacting. Moving away from the big pictures, we need to drill down and understand that. And the case of China is quite interesting because it's definitely a decline in postgrad. India, for example, is more of a vet sector decline. And as you can see, it has been 3 years in a row that we had this decline in commencements. But in contrast, we have Nepal, our third largest source country, which is showing more of a steady, kind of a stabilized actually number of commencements in comparison to what we had in the last 3 years. Now, all these up and downs and difference across markets is obviously not only in these top 3, but actually in every single one of the different source markets. As you can see here, the complete lot. Number 4, Vietnam, Colombia, for example, with a very, very sharp decline, the same like Brazil. And then we have some surprises like Bangladesh, which actually have been actually showing some substantial growth since 2023. So this actually illustrates the level of volatility and complexity that education providers and the sector as a whole has had to be dealing with. And I understand the rationality from the government, the need of correction, but I think if we want to meet halfway, I think it's also important to understand this high level of complexity that we have to deal with. If you are an education provider that has been engaged with one of these markets for probably 5, 6, 7, or 10 years, you cannot just remove those relationships in one day. You cannot just leave and go to another market. It takes time for us just to adjust our strategies, and I think that's going to be a very important part of how we can actually move forward. So overall, as you can imagine, these change in policies have significantly fractured the sector and also have been changing the way in which we have been engaging with different markets. And that's probably the main challenge when we think about moving forward, how we can actually fix that as a sector. And that's when I move and I try to look into the future. And this is the big leap of faith because really, we are just learning about this. So what can we expect and what the data is telling us about the future for the sector? Now, what I'm going to try to do here is probably going from 2025, which we know how things have changing, then trying to go to 2026, where we know a few things that may actually lead to the future of the sector, and then the future going 2027 and beyond. For 2025, we have enough data. We have all the way to July commencements that clearly shows that, for example, the effects of the second half of the year are more evident. And this is because Ministerial Direction 111 is not a hard cap. It's a way just to manage volume. But as numbers were progressing and education providers reached that 80% threshold, that's when they start seeing the delay on visas getting granted. So we still need to learn a little bit, but pretty much what we can tell at this stage is that the decline in English language and VET will continue. And for higher education, there are mixed results. I think the overall number for higher education is that we most likely will be flat in comparison to the levels that we had in 2024. Also, full disclosure, we actually estimate at the start of the year that the decline will be 5%. It seems going to be about 2% or probably close to 0. So pretty much the same numbers. But once again, we're going to have different results across the sector, across education providers, across universities. So that's something that we need to look in detail and not only look at the big number because it's very important just to understand where everybody is at. Now that's 2025. In 2026, we still don't know. I think that it has been welcomed by some parts of the sector, and I should underline that it's some parts of the sector, because if you are an English language provider, you obviously want to see some changes, because obviously you have been affected quite significantly. But for higher education providers and other parts of the sector, like schools, I think knowing that we will have continuity in policies is something that it helps just to plan for the future. Now, what we also know, and this is a very interesting aspect of the policy, because for the first time, I think that we saw a change in the narrative of the government. And they introduced first an increase in the allocated NOSC. It was an increase of 9%. But it doesn't seem like that, but it's actually quite substantial considering where we were at. But also, for the first time, they basically provide what we can call 2 carrots to the sector. So if we follow certain things that the government thinks are for the benefit of the nation, universities in particular will get an additional number of the NOSC level that they had for this year. Now, what I think is quite interesting about these 2 carrots is that they align in many, many ways to economic aspects of what the nation is looking for. When they actually talk about extending accommodation, student accommodation, it was not about necessarily looking for accommodation in homestay, but it was more about building and investing. Actually, the word used is investing in student accommodation, which is attached to an economic indicator. And the other one is that relationship with Southeast Asia, that from an international trade perspective is very important. So that's when I think, and this is what Davina was saying, and we can debate that probably what we are looking is to something a little bit different. What we look is that the model has been shaped by politics, and may be shaped by politics for a long time, but it's going to be driven by economic factors. That balance between what is the policy and the politics, I think actually is going to be complemented with the economic needs. And when you actually are in the middle of a trade war, and probably it's interesting actually to read what the Reserve Bank was saying a couple of weeks ago about how uncertain and volatile is the international financial markets and the international trade markets. I think that the government knows that the visitor economy, and we are part of the visitor economy, is a very important part that they need to look after in certain ways. So I think we're going to see in the next couple of years, and definitely in 2026, a narrative and probably a policy that will try to balance politics and economic factors. And specifically, the narrative that exists in the policy front about migration, that is more leading into anti-migration, with the benefits that international education bring from an economic point of view. So that's what I think is from a government point of view. So we might actually need to discuss this, and it would be great if we can discuss this from a sector perspective. Now, moving a little bit forward, things get more interesting in my opinion. So thinking about 2027 and beyond, and probably you will be like, Kerry, why we care about 2027? Well, for this sector, we really need that long-term planning. That has been one of the rich parts of the sector that allows us not only to understand where we want to be, what we want to be, what's our identity, but also when you have a pipeline of a student recruitment of 18 months, in a few months you are going to be recruiting students for 2027. So we really need that long-term perspective to move forward. Now, I couldn't find any data that really suggests where we're going to go. So I actually look into the past to try to understand the future. And I actually look into this book, there is no digital version of it, no PDF, no podcast, definitely not TikTok about it. It's just paper and ink. But it's definitely one of the biggest treasures that we have in this sector. It basically collects 15 years of international education and what we have been doing just to really build this sector. A lot of universities in the library will have a version of this book if you are interested. Hopefully we'll have a digital version so we can actually share the lessons. But something that I found fascinating is that the last chapter of this book, and I'm just going to show it in a minute, the last chapter actually is called Horizon 2025. So this book was actually published in 2011, and the contributors, the authors, had that view that exists for many years of really thinking where we want to be, what's going to be the identity of the international education sector in 2025. So really, really forward thinking. Now, I found that it was fascinating to read that chapter, and I highly recommend it to you if you can get a copy of this. But just to summarize, something that it was quite interesting is that the authors, thinking about this is going back to 2010, I insist, they were thinking, what's going to be the view and the identity of the international education sector by 2025, but also what are going to be the factors where international education will contribute for the nation in particular, and what's going to allow us just to still continue giving that contribution to the country. And things are actually quite different, and when you look at the summary of the things that this book is saying, I think that raise the challenges that we currently have. The book basically says that in order to contribute to the economy and to the nation, we still need to find our unique Australian value proposition. And I think that's gonna be one of the big challenges, because I think that we're a little bit lost after not only 2 years of changes in the policy front, but also another 2 years of dealing with COVID. Like as simple as this, are we still a welcoming destination? I think we are, but if you're an ELICOS student, an English language student that wants to come and they need to pay $2,000 just to apply for a non-refundable visa, probably they are not thinking that we are well welcoming. So we really need to take the time, and hopefully we'll do that, just to find that unique Australian values and the value proposition that will help us just to move forward. Now the book also includes another one that is interesting. It says, in order to contribute in the future years, the international education needs to have cooperation across sector. And unfortunately, because we are fragmented, that's something that is not happening for obvious reasons. But hopefully, we're going to be able just to find those levels of cooperation, which it has been historically one of the great assets of the sector. We used to work together for the benefit of the sector and for the students as well. Now, there are two very interesting factors also that are included in this book that I think they have been either put in the lower list of priorities or have been forgotten. And these ones are, once again, to have balanced growth. So the vision that the sector had in 2010 is, yes, we need to spread the benefit of international education, not only for students coming, but also for students outgoing and having those experiences outside of Australia. And unfortunately, and we all know that we have been dealing with a very difficult period, but that's one that unfortunately it has been dropping in the list of priorities. But the other one is quite interesting. Basically, the book says that by 2025, we're going to have such a volume of international alumni in senior positions that they're going to be at the front of helping us dealing with trade, making connections, and helping those people-to-people relationships just to actually get the most out of that experience that they had as students, now as professionals. And that's one that I don't think we have heard about that in a long time. I don't think we have talked about that one. So one of those precious assets and those things that we build, unfortunately, also have been moving away from the list of priorities. Basically, it's talking about our international alumni. And as you can you imagine in the middle of this volatility in international trade, all the conversations that are happening, all the negotiations, the role that that international alumni is currently have or could have to assist us is just remarkable. Now, apart from those 4 interesting categories, I think the ones that are also, for me, were surprising is the ones who are not included in this book. So in the vision that we had of the sector in 2010, there is no mention that international education should be the fix of the funding problem that universities have. In fact, actually, they warn that international education should not be the main way just to fix the funding problem of universities. In the same way, there is no mention about how international education should fix the skill gaps problem that we have in the country. Now, I'm not saying that probably we should pursue that, but I think that what is interesting is that somehow, in the last 15 years, we kind of probably changed our identity, or lost our identity, or just basically brought some things that we haven't considered that we need to embark and seriously take care if we want to go there. So for that reason, and after thinking for a while, I think that a really good step, and hopefully we'll have that conversation in the next couple of years, is just to create a new national strategy. We really need something that brings our identity and gives us the opportunity to think where we want to be and what we want to be in 2030, 2025. You can decide when, but we need that long-term idea of where we're going to go if we want to move forward. Now, what I think is interesting about the last time that we did this national strategy, which I have to say, it was a remarkable work done by government and sector. And I'm saying it's remarkable because it was done under very, very difficult circumstances. Like the last national strategy was done in 2021, 2021, which we were in the thick of COVID. A lot of us were in lockdown, working in this, putting contributions and trying just to put our views. So basically, I always think about how we were developing this national strategy as we were all in a lift. The lift is falling down, is on fire, we're pressing the emergency button, and somebody comes and said, hey guys, what are your plans for the next 5 to 10 years? So the timing was not the right time. And things have changed so much that I think we need to actually spend some time in really rethinking where we're gonna go in the way that we actually move forward. Now, I think we all welcome the fact that the government is thinking about creating a new policy framework, but once again, that's the frame, and I think what we need to think is about the canvas, so we can actually keep doing what we love to do, which is to provide those extraordinary experiences to individuals from all around the world. And that's it. I hope you find it interesting. Thank you. Oh, and if you want the slides, they are there.
Right, let's talk. Okay, thank you, Kerry. We have a few questions coming through. Thank you to the audience, but could really do with a few more or some more votes. So please don't be shy. I wanted to start it out, as I started, on a slightly more personal nature. When you made a decision to come to Australia as an international student, what was the value proposition?
Well, it's a fun and interesting story. Because that shows how things have changed so much.
Yeah.
Australia was, for me, an appealing destination because of the lifestyle. Like, the quality of education was not even on the radar for me, was not a consideration. It was an affordable destination, so it was the opportunity to combine, maybe the opportunity to work while I study. So it seems like something that it was quite attractive in terms of something that I can consider just to do and pursue my studies. Now, what I think, and I love to tell that story, also in that AIEC in Gadigal, Sydney in 2004, I was remembering a room like this, and we had a town hall meeting. Probably you remember that one. Because the sector was about to decide something that I think actually changed a lot on the value proposition that we actually have been managing for many years. So on that AIEC, I remember it was a town hall, it was completely full. It was a session that it was led by Tony Adams. We had representatives from Australia, from the State Departments, from the Department of Education, and the question was as simple as this. Are we gonna promote Australia as a lifestyle destination or a quality destination? And you know, it was a very interesting debate. And at the end, it was just raise your hands. And I remember I voted for the koalas and the kangaroos. No, I was like, quality destination, what are we talking about? But quality destination won, not by a lot, but won. And everybody followed that narrative for, 15 years. And now if you see a lot of the international student service, like QS or IDP, quality education is one of the main factors that are bringing students to Australia. So when we put our direction, our identity together, we actually managed to accomplish that. And that's, it was a lot of research done in order to do that. But we actually managed to change the narrative of the sector for something that will bring us to where we want to be.
Koalas and kangaroos, that's why you came.
Yeah.
But I think it is a good reflection on where we were, and there's a lot of factors that have played into that direction, but it's also an existential question around what is quality when a student is saying they're coming for a quality education, which may include the koalas and the kangaroos and the lifestyle as part of that. Okay, first question, you get the hard one, the hardcore data question. Do you think some of the growth in 2023 post-COVID was inflated due to students completing rather than commencing, as students didn't need a visa during COVID? Maybe we are not declining. Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, look, I heard that question a couple of times, and it's very technical. Like, it's true that during the time of COVID, we had a lot of students who did not a student visa because they didn't require that. So the moment that they could return to Australia, they actually applied for the student visa, and they actually came as part of the metric, basically. So yeah, there is an element of that, and I think that also shows that continuous engagement that the sector had with the students, even though we couldn't not go and travel and talk to them, actually paid off, because a lot of students commenced their studies during COVID outside of Australia, and they were basically doing things online. That was another big innovation that we had in the sector, like moving to online delivery. So yeah, there is an element of that, but also for what we can see in other study destinations like Canada and the US, it was actually a surge in the demand for international education. So it was a combination of a couple of things, in my opinion.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to ask the audience to give some indication. Kerry floated the figure of -2% as the outcome for 2025.
For higher education?
For higher education. So, I wanted to do a show of hands. How many of you think it will be more than 2%, -2% decline? Okay, I can see a few people. And how many think it will be less, and we may even be positive in 2025? Let's say maybe more positive than negative. That's interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'll go to our next question. And this one comes from John Ross. Hi, John. He's asking your forecast on Minister Hill said this morning that there would be a new ministerial directive later in the year, which can't get much, let's say in November. Do you have a sense of what the likely changes might be?
I actually don't think there's going to be a lot of changes in that regard. I think that whatever is the number for the next ministerial direction, most likely is going to be, again, that 80% threshold. I think that there is a sense from the government that that's working in the way in which they're managing volume. And I think let's just leave it like that for another 12 months and see how we continue managing the growth. Because the actual number that is, like, ministerial direction is just the instrument, but the actual number that shows the real direction is the allocation that it was given to each university. And that's a completely different story. You know? So I don't think that ministerial direction per se is going to change in terms of an instrument, but that's just my guess. We can expect anything, really.
And there's some value in some stability.
Yes.
At least we know what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Or sort of. Okay. Any other comments you wanted to make at the moment, or should we go to the next?
No, she was for drinks. So.
We are 10 minutes from drinks, Kerry.
Okay, not good.
Okay, Mr. Cami in the front tables asked about, you made a comment on cooperation now versus cooperation before when it was better.
Cooperation?
Cooperation between universities in the sector, cooperation within the sector.
Yeah. I think that's something that it's more like in the air than what we actually see in terms of actual strategies that have been putting together. I think everybody's still sitting in the room, everybody's still trying to do their best, but the level of the way in which the policy has been pushing institutions into finding ways to cover that financial gap, I think is pushing for more higher levels of competitiveness between education providers. And because everybody's in a different position as well, it's very hard to find common ground. as simple as budgeting for a project where all universities can do together. I think, like, let's just say we're just gonna make this student fair in a particular new emerging market. Well, some universities probably are more well-resourced at the moment than others, when before probably everybody was kind of at the same level or in the same range. So that's kind of the levels of cooperations that exist. But also we have seen it in how every institution is actually, the voice that every institution has in regards to the policy. Some institutions are probably, I wouldn't say, I will say they're less favorable than others, but others are actually feeling it and they're actually more open about saying this has to change. So yeah, I think it's more about that. So.
At that time, there was also a much larger public presence in international education. So in the terms of Minister Hill, many more rats and mice as the privates at the time, and there is more power now and also larger groups and institutions in the private sector. So more diversity of types of institutions as well. That's
very true. Like if you actually follow the history in the last 15 years, the volume of students in each institution have changed significantly. Like you know, probably the average was about 1,000 students and the maximum was 2,000 students, so a considerable range. Now we see big ranges across the different universities. So, yeah.
Okay. Now, just drawing on some of your benchmarking work, particularly in the learning abroad sector, what do you think would make the most difference to get learning abroad back on track?
Yeah, look, there are a couple of things in the area of outbound mobility. When you look at the data before COVID, clearly universities were able to invest more in learning abroad. The level of institutional funding to support students to go overseas, it was a lot higher. That actually period of growth that I show on the chart, it was a combined effort of government and institutions, like New Colombo Plan came on board, but also institutions were able just to invest and provide travel grants. That unfortunately has been fading away. So hopefully in the next couple of years, because it is not gonna happen soon, we're gonna be able to see the level of institutional funding to support those experiences to increase. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the value that outbound mobility brings to the sector and to the different strategies that we put in place. When we had 60,000 students abroad, basically we had 60,000 ambassadors talking about what is living in Australia, how important it is to make connections, and now we are not at those levels, unfortunately. And we don't probably, we lost perspective on the value that that had to complement our strategies as well.
And we also had 60,000 young people coming back into their homes and their families talking about the value of international education.
Yes.
So we've lost some of the power of engaging with community through a decline in support for learning abroad programs at an institutional level.
Yeah, totally. And also affects the student experience of international students. And let me explain to you why. I was in New Zealand about I think it's 3 weeks ago or something. They're actually they're experiencing a surge in the number of international students, but they don't have a lot of New Zealand students going overseas. And what some universities are saying is that the domestic students don't understand the difference that exists between an international student and being in a different country. In fact, they question why they're getting all this support, because they haven't had that experience of being overseas. So in that period, when we actually had a balanced sector, I think was a lot of those stories and a better understanding of what's to be outside of your home country. And I think that helped the experience of international students as well. You know, when you find somebody that understands what you're going through, it's part of the value proposition that we used to have.
Yeah, that's quite insightful. Thank you to our Kiwi colleagues for some of that insight. We have one more technical question that's come through about the number of COEs versus the number of students. So is there a myth that we had 1 million new students, and should we be doing something about that?
Yeah, that's not a myth. It's a misquoted number. So just to explain, we actually covered that in the Data Master class for beginners yesterday. So there are differences between number of enrollments and number of individuals in the country. So at the moment, it's about 650,000 temporary student visa holders that are currently here. So if we take a photo of all of them, it's about 650,000. Now, those students, in a period of 12 months, maybe they enroll in 1 or 2 courses. Let's say that they start doing English, and then from there they progress to full degree. So if they actually enroll in 2 courses, that counts as 2 enrollments. So because of that, we actually had about 1 million enrollments. This is actually quite common in the vocational sector, when you can actually do a certificate 3 or certificate 4, and then you can actually progress to something else. So we actually had about 650,000 primary temporary student visa holders, and I'm very trying to do it because there's also a different, anyhow, there are other conversations about that, so that's the actual figure, that you actually could enroll in more courses, and that's why there is the 1 million figure.
I'm going to ask this question because it's a bit of a controversial one, but is there a sweet spot on diversification of the student body? The question says somewhere between 15 and 30% is the ideal. Do you think there is a sweet spot?
Look, I have always been against a specific number. Like, why it has to be 13, not 14, not 15? I think that what we need to balance is the role of not the universities, but each university, because each university has different goals, different characteristics, and they were actually developed with a different mission. But also, it has to be a balance across the sector. So it's not as simple as just saying 50% cutoff. I know that sometimes you need a reference point, but I think it's just how we can actually balance the role of each university. It's very different to be a regional university than being a metropolitan research-intensive university, and we are very lucky that we have a rich university sector, and for that reason, to put everybody in the same bucket, I think is very complicated. So, yeah, I don't have a number. I think what we need to have is a conversation about it.
And different, that's what the compact process is about, is institutions deciding what they want their profile to be to some extent. And if this can be a healthy conversation, then perhaps it will move on some of the ideology around that is trying to pin down a number that the sector should be. Okay, we'll go one more question because I have 1 minute and 31 seconds to go. During the perfect storm, there was a large pool of onshore students navigating pathways to continue in country. Is this different to now, as we are also seeing a somewhat similar trend? What's the difference to what it was back in that era?
That's a really good question. And it's true. During the perfect storm, one of the reasons why we had a change in the policy framework is because it was this link between a preference to study a particular course aiming to achieve permanent residence. And it was creating a distortion in the way both sectors, well, both part of the sector, study, but also migration, would actually collaborate and work together. Now, I think that in this case, and I think that there is an acknowledgement from the government about this, they tried to stop that to happen. Like they saw that it was coming and they thought, let's just do something just to not have to deal with that issue because the volumes were there. I haven't seen, to be honest, a data set that at the moment connects that. I think that it was more of a preventive measure, knowing that something actually could create a more complicated scenario. So that's what I think was happening.
And that was the era of cooks and hairdressers and accountants, and that's sometimes referred to again in commentary, that we have some similar things coming up.
Yep.
But we also know that the hospitality industry genuinely has skills gaps at the moment. So perhaps that's what's changed, is actually the job market, and then that connection to the sector and what's driving.
But that's why we need to discuss as a sector if we're actually going to be embarking in this conversation of being a key factor to reduce the skill gaps of the nation, because that's a very, very big challenge that requires a change in the mindset of the sector and the policy that I think we need to prepare to take if we're going to go into that path. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing or a good thing, but I think we need to really think about where we're going to go from here.
Well, Kerry, thank you for your very considered and your openness in sharing your data. I just wanted to finish with one note on the economic framework that you've provided us, and that we will be driven by economic factors. And that's something I was reflecting on in the piece that I wrote recently, is that at the end of the day, our students are rational actors, and they and their families will follow the right action for them. And so the policy overlay, to some extent, will always be lose out to the rational actors who are paying for their education at the end of the day. And so how much we can steer that is a challenge in the policy settings. And as institutions who are educating young people, it's also part of our mission is to help them become the humans they want to be in the future. And let those rational actors choose the courses that they want to do. So I think we'll wrap up there. Could you help me thank Kerry? And I wish everyone a great evening this evening.